Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the Global Sustainability Author Webinar Series. If you didn't already know, Global Sustainability is an open access journal published by Cambridge University Press with Johan Rockstrom as editor-in-chief and a reputable supporting editorial team. We're delighted to be bringing you this webinar series thanks to our editors and authors. Today, we're joined by special guest speaker, Dirk Bezemer, and in a moment, I'll hand over to Bert de Vries, one of the deputy editors for Global Sustainability, who will introduce today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have all joined in listen-only mode, which means you'll be able to hear us, but not able to speak to us. However, you will have the opportunity to submit chat questions by typing your questions into the Q&A of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the webinar. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If we are unable to get through all of the questions during the session, they will be included in the Q&A document that we will send after the webinar. Should you experience any technical difficulties, please add these to the question box and a member of the organizing team will endeavor to help you. In the unlikely event that we experience any issues, we will message the audience and restart the webinar. So to summarize, you can submit your questions at any time. You'll also receive a survey at the end to know how so you can let us know how useful you found it, and there's another opportunity to ask any questions that you have. So to kick things off, I'd like to invite Bert de Vries, Deputy Editor of Global Sustainability.
All right. Thank you, Alison, for the opportunity to introduce the speaker. The journal Global Sustainability has, in its first 3-4 years, tried to invite scientists to talk about global sustainability from a really integrative, interdisciplinary perspective. And I think on the one hand, it's good, and on the other hand, somewhat strange perhaps, that we start now with, as our first speaker, an economist, because most of the time, the global sustainability community is made up of natural scientists. And many of our articles still have that bias. But personally, I think we should attempt to get also the social scientists, among them the economists, into this discourse and into this platform. And I myself, as a member of the Utrecht Sustainable Finance Lab, realized over the last 10 years how important it is to engage with economists, or maybe I should say with critical economists, who are willing, just like some people do in a journal like ecological economics, to really engage with sustainability issues from an economics perspective and also a critical economics perspective. And I ventured a bit into these topics when I studied Dirk Bezemer's work on inequality, and I realized that many of the Sustainable Development Goals, who have directly and indirectly to do with inequality, are actually strongly dependent on the way we have organized the financial system in the world. And also with other colleagues, I realized that the deregulation in the 80s has made the financial system into something which is often, I would say, damaging our goals for a sustainable future instead of helping. And at the same time, we do need the financial system, obviously. So it's important to think freely about, on the one hand, other ways of regulating and organizing the financial system, including the debate we have at the Sustainable Finance Lab about who is actually to create money. And secondly, we need creativity in exploring other ways of making the financial system more helpful in realizing the Sustainable Development Goals. So with this short introduction, I think I should give the floor to Dirk Bezemer, who is Professor of Economics at Groningen University, and who has published quite some papers, but also an interesting booklet called The Land of Small Buffers. Maybe Dirk can explain it himself, which is, I would say, quite a communicable treatise on how the financial system is working these days, and how, given these insights, we could now use this moment with the COVID pandemic to make some structural or maybe more operational changes in that system, because this COVID pandemic may give us opportunities. And that's why Dirk chose the title for his paper in Global Sustainability, Seize the Day. So my invitation to you, Dirk, is can you explain us what it means that we now in this period of the COVID-19 pandemic should seize the day? I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Bert, for this clear introduction. Let me immediately connect to that and say that the book that I wrote, which is written in Dutch, unfortunately for the international viewers and listeners, it's already outdated in a sense, because the public mood in with regard to the corona crisis and sustainability issues has been moving very fast indeed. Bert was correct in saying that I felt that we should seize the opportunity last year, which the corona crisis presented to us, and not just a crisis, not just a virus, but the public policy response to it as well. And I will speak for about 15 minutes about my book and about what I wrote about this. But I want to start by taking you back to 1 year ago, one and a bit, and reading out to you a Financial Times editorial of the 3rd of April 2020. The editor, so this is not a letter to the editors. This was not some left-wing radical writing a letter to the Financial Times. This is an editorial from the Financial Times, which is of course not a revolutionary newspaper. But the editors wrote on 3rd of April 2020, there has to be a radical reform of the policies that we've seen over the last 4 decades. So there was this end of an era feeling. Sorry, I will continue. Governments should play a much more active role in the economy. Government services have to be seen as investments rather than a burden. Labor markets have to be made safe. Redistribution has to be put back on the agenda. And the privileges of the older and the richer, the older generation and the rich are no longer unquestioned. Policy that until recently was seen as exotic, like basic income and capital taxes, will have to be part of a new policy package. End of quote. I translated back from the Dutch, which it is in my book, to the English, but originally it was English, very much like what I said. Now, if you've been listening along, this is radical indeed. Even basic income, which is a very radical measure indeed, is mentioned as something that has to be part of a new policy package by the Financial Times editors. And this was reflective, this was representative of the general public mood in the spring of 2020, when the world was suddenly stopped in its tracks. We were all sitting inside or maybe outside because the weather was gorgeous, at least here in the Netherlands it was. And we were all reflecting on what does this mean? And is this the end of an era? What is the system we're in that makes this sudden stop possible? And what is the government? If it is possible to do this, can it not also do many other things that we've been telling ourselves that cannot be done because it's all very complex and so on and so on, like capital taxes, like basic income, like labor markets flexibility or labor market insecurity rather, and like the small roles of the government and the big role of the market, which had been the norm for 4 decades, but which the Financial Times editor said 4 decades has been long enough. That was the mood in which I thought the research that I've been doing over the last more than 10 years on the role of the financial system in the economic system equips me, I think, to write down what can be changed. What is a realistic scenario to seize the day in this respect, to change the economy where we are in, and to foster sustainability, not just ecological or climate sustainability, but also social sustainability. And it's one of the big premises in my book is that, and in the article, is that there cannot be a real change in ecological sustainability in policy that fosters sustainability, that fights climate change or that prepares for climate change effectively. This cannot happen unless we also build social sustainability, because in democracies and probably also in other countries, there needs to be the support of the population to the cost, to carry the costs of this big change. And I actually quote John Maynard Keynes, the famous British economist, who in the days of the so-called phony war in Britain at the autumn of 1939 and early 1940, was writing about how to pay for the war. So we need to prepare the financial system to face the challenges. Then it was a war. Now it's been the Corona crisis has been compared to a war many times, but it's certainly a challenge that a year ago seemed almost as big as fighting a war. And beyond that, we need to prepare for climate change and how to deal with it or how to fight it. In that, we need to change the financial system and we need to change the economy and the social system to do that. This by way of introduction to my article, which itself is a very short insight in what the book is about. Now, in the article, I first note that there's we can talk about seizing the day, not just out of a sort of empty and easy sentiment. It's not just empty words, but there was real change, and to an extent there is real change still a year later. In 2 respects. The first respect is change in the public mood. The pendulum is really swinging back away from what's often been called neoliberalism, away from the idea that the government's role must be smaller and the market's role must be bigger, that the financial system needs to take precedence over the real economy, that company profits need to take precedence over wages, and that shareholder revenues like dividends need to take precedence over profits. This system has left us with an economy where investment, so fixed capital investment, I mean physical investment, has plummeted, where productivity has been stalling, and where real wages over the last 20 years and more have been lagging economic growth, and where wealth has become concentrated in an incredible way, especially in the US and the UK, but also on the European continent. And this is undermining the basis for the economic and social system itself, but it's also undermining our ability to make those changes in the economic system that are needed for a number of reasons, including ecological sustainability. And this is very much about physical change. I think all the science, all the natural science shows us that there needs to be physical change in sense of degrowth. So less production and less consumption, less emission, therefore, in order to stabilize the climate. And we cannot do that unless we change the economic system, which is a system that is built for growth. It's built for growth in a financial sense, growth that generates profits. And the challenge for us economists, I think, is to think about the opportunities to maintain a system called capitalism that is built for growth, that is centered around companies that make profit and still have physical degrowth. So to have less emissions based on less production and consumption. Of course, part of that we've been doing already by producing higher value added, cleaner things, but we cannot escape the necessity of simply producing less also, and the big challenge is how to do that. Now, what opportunities does the Corona crisis give us to start making these changes and to accelerate the change processes that had already started, but which were proceeding very sluggishly and very slowly? The first, that which I already mentioned, is the change in the public mood, which is reflected in the Financial Times editorial. That needs no further explanation. When so many people, all of a sudden, and so many governments also are open to, and so many prominent newspapers are open to radical change, that is an opportunity to seize the day. And the second change that I refer to is actual physical change. And I mentioned 6 areas in the paper in which actual change was taking place. And I will briefly note them now by way of ending my introduction of the paper and my overview. The first is debt, is the enormous amount of debt. This is going to play, it is playing out as I'm talking, and it's going to play out over the next years, maybe the next decade even, just as the financial crisis casts a shadow over the financial system, private finances and government finances for a decade and more. Private debt is now skyrocketing. Government debt for some countries is skyrocketing, not in this country, but in some countries it is. And we need to rethink the system, the financial system that we have, and the growth of government and private debt that the Corona crisis has caused. And this may, so actually the situation is worse, the debts are higher, but this may actually put enough pressure on policymakers and on financial regulators and central banks to change the system to a system where we generate less debt for a given amount of production, because that's what's happening now. And especially that's happening because so much of the lending and the borrowing is going on in asset markets, in property markets, in shares and bonds and derivatives and other asset markets, and not in the real economy, not in the system of production and consumption that needs to be financed. So this overhead of liabilities of debt needs to be restructured. The 5 other areas that I discussed in the paper are not financial or are not financial, but they are real. They are about the physical way we organize the economy. And I'm not a specialist in these issues, but it is clear that there are big opportunities and big changes already going on. The first is urban transport. Immediately at the start of the Corona crisis, many cities had to change their urban transport system because you simply cannot cram people into trains. You have to find ways to move them around while having to keep the distance from each other. And also you cannot all let them go into their cars because that would cramp city centers. So cycling lanes, as an example, it's not the only thing, but as an example, cycling lanes were quickly introduced or extended in many cities, including Barcelona and Paris, which are examples where they did it radically. And this may be made permanent. So this can be a big boost to climate-friendly and sustainable urban transport systems. Linked to this, I want to mention urban property markets. When more people start working from home, and we already have a lot of evidence that companies and government services are now contemplating to restructure their property portfolio, the buildings, the offices that they have, because part of their employees can work at home and want to work at home more days per week. And this will be a revolution also in urban transport again, when the flow of commuters in and out of cities will become much less. And this can really change quite radically within a few years, because we've seen it happen in the last year. The second area I'll mention is IT, information and communication technology. The use of computers, of course, has allowed us to stay inside and still continue working. And again, this is not going to go away. And this offers huge opportunities to change our way of working in a much more climate friendly and sustainable way. I'll say no more about this because this has been discussed many times over. The third is the energy transition. The price of oil plummeted immediately after the start of the corona crisis. A very famous fact that oil taxes oil even became briefly negative because storing it was so expensive. The price of oil has bounced back. But the awareness that the oil and gas markets are very vulnerable to economic shocks, and the awareness that is actually our energy use that is a long-term problem connected to the corona crisis, of course, which is again connected to the globalized economy. All this came together in an awareness that we need to change the energy sector. The so-called fossil fuel sector is receiving huge subsidies in every advanced economy, in every high-income economy. If we could only scale down those subsidies and redirect them to innovations that support sustainable energy, that would be a massive change coming out of the corona crisis. But of course, much more is possible. The fourth thing I want to mention is global value chains. Connected to my last point, the corona crisis made it clear, demonstrated to us how incredibly vulnerable global value chains are, and at the same time, how they make us vulnerable to things like viruses and to other things as well. So there was I think in the first half, especially of 2020, there was quite an intense debate about deglobalization or slowbalization. Actually, that's a trend that's already started. So the increase in globalization had already stopped and was reversed by in the richer countries, economic activity and production being taken home domestically already to an extent. And the corona crisis threw up the question, should we not do more of this? Maybe not because it's good for the company's bottom line for profit, but because it's good for our resilience. How resilient are we when we outsource production to faraway sites, and we move the inputs and the outputs with a lot of emissions around? Even though that's cheap in dollars and euros and pounds, is it cheap in terms of economic resilience and in terms of sustainability? And the final sector that I mentioned is aviation. Of course, it was immediately incredibly clear how vulnerable aviation airline companies are to the crisis when a lot of travel was banned, and they're still struggling with this. Beyond this, I don't think we will all stop flying all of a sudden, but beyond this, it also became clear the incredible amount of subsidies that's going into the aviation industry to keep it afloat, the lack of profit that's being made there, and the profits that are being made, the fact that they are mostly passed on to shareholders, and that now governments are, in my country, the government is paying through its nose to keep the national airline company afloat, while they have been giving out their profits to their shareholders. So this is a sort of poster child for unsustainable business models, not just ecologically, but also in terms of the way we use our finances. Okay, so there's no time to really go into the details of each of these markets and each of these cases. It's just to highlight the fact that there's a big opportunity for change because the public mood has changed, and because processes of change, some of which had already started before 2020, have been accelerated by the corona crisis. And we now need to seize the day, not lose this momentum, even though the public mood seems to have changed back again, but we should not lose the momentum to use the opportunities offered to us in the year 2020, also in the year 21 and beyond. Thank you. Have I talked for too long? Good.
Not at all. So Would you like me to continue now? It's my guess, yes. Well, personally, I cannot see actually if there are any questions from the audience. But at the moment, I have at least one question, because my understanding is you identify a number of issues which were already, let's say, trends in the right direction. And what you are suggesting is that this pandemic gives us the opportunity, because it's an opportunity to accelerate some tendencies which were already going on. One question I have is, it's somewhat related to a book by Tim Jackson, Prosperity Without Growth, in which he claimed 10, 15 years ago, and I think it's still a claim, that you cannot have absolute decoupling. So if we have really economic growth, then an absolute decoupling, which means absolute reduction in emissions, or at least number of important emissions, is not to be expected. So my question then is, suppose we are no longer having massive flows of money going into financial assets and maybe stock markets, and they go back again into physical investments in the real economy. Is there any reason to expect that we then will have lower emissions? Are you optimistic about the fact that then the capitalist system as it is will indeed channel those new or additional flows of investments in two directions which help us towards more sustainability? Or could we as well expect that they will go for the kind of growth which is actually, as Tim Jackson suggests, not giving us decoupling, or at best relative decoupling? What is your view on this?
Yes, thank you for this question, which is, as they used to say, the $64,000 question. Nowadays, the million-dollar question, I suppose. So I think we need to distinguish between two things. The first is to recognize the fact that most of the financial system is serving asset markets, above all property markets, real estate markets, but also other asset markets, shares, bonds, and so on. And that there is no lack of money in the hard dollar sense, no lack of money to do the things that we need doing, whatever they are, because this is a very common objection to if we talk about, for instance, the Green New Deal or large investment schemes into sustainability. How are we going to pay for this? Well, if you look at a bigger picture and you see the enormous amounts of money that we are investing each day into asset markets, where they just, or in short term, where they primarily increase asset values, including property values, causing huge problems, along with causing huge wealth for a minority. If we reorganize that system, mainly through taxes, I think, there is no lack of money. So that's the first point I want to make. The second is, if we manage to do that, even partly, will this money for which is going to be used in the real economy for actual physical fixed investment, will that be cleaner production? Yes or no? And there's absolutely no reason, I agree, to expect automatically that there will be magically be cleaner production. In any case, for those plans that we have to green the economy, for which financing was often a barrier, that will be much less the case when we reorganize the financial system. And partly this already seems to have happened when we see the very ambitious plans in the United States, which are directed explicitly towards a green economy. So President Biden is just doing what he promised in his presidential election program. That hurdle seems to have been taken. Only yesterday he was announcing that he will change the tax system and tax more of the wealth, which means that more government money comes in the hands of the government, and the government is now, the administration is now committed to green investments. So in this way, yes, a reorganization of the financial part of the economic system may actually lead to greener growth. the second question, and the more fundamental question, is, can we have investment and growth in the economic system and degrowth in emissions? And I declare myself not specialist enough to say yes or no to this. And I think one of the jobs of economists is to, and Tim Jackson, of course, is one of the people doing this, is to think very hard about this question, because if we need to, let's say, liquidate, I think, well, my hunch is that we cannot do without liquidating quite a lot of the most polluting or emission-rich economic activities. So that, but the question is whether on net we can start enough other activities to provide for employment and income for populations, because that is the task of the economic system. That's the challenge we have. Here in the Netherlands, I'm part of a project group, a very wide group of NGOs and trade unions and companies and so on, who together have presented and are going to present a just and green transition plan, which emphasizes that there needs to be a green transition, but also it needs to be one that creates employment and income for enough people. That is the challenge.
Okay, thank you. Just two brief comments. The first one is basically what you're saying is it's important that governments, and this is the trend, that we no longer wish governments to become smaller and smaller, but governments have an important role, obviously. And the second brief comment I wanted to make is, indeed, we will have to provide employment, because that's for many people as important, perhaps, as the longer term sustainability issues. What I do see, I remember this from analysis we did long ago, that perhaps by investing heavily into the Green Deal, we may actually for a while have an increase in all kinds of environmental pressure. Simply because if we are going to invest massively in heat pumps, those heat pumps have to be made. And usually they're made from steel or other metals. And the labor component may be relatively high, but the cheaper they become, the smaller the labor component and the smaller the contribution to employment. So I hope economists will, over the next couple of years, investigate this in more detail to see what happens if those massive money flows finally become available. How do you channel them with support of the government? And secondly, could it be that at least for a while, the net effect may be that we have increasing emissions, and only later on, as with many things in life, only later on we see the good things appear. I think there is no other question answer, but then I may ask my second question, Dirk, maybe also the end of this webinar. Many non-economists, and maybe even many economists, have noticed, at least the ones who follow the world a little bit, that about 10, 12 years ago, governments in the financial crisis said that we have to cut the budgets. We have to, what's the word? I mean, reduce budgets for the public sectors, and in all kinds of ways we have to bezuinigen. What's the English word for bezuinigen? I just forgot. Anyway, we have to
cut the budgets. Cut the budgets. That's the term.
Personally, we have to prepare for times of poverty, and this is what we did 10, 12 years ago. Especially in Europe, we were quite strong with these austerity policies. That was the word I was looking for. For many people, it's surprising to see that only 10, 12 years later, with the support of most economists, with the COVID pandemic, we are doing exactly the opposite. We easily create here in the Netherlands 60, 70 billion to help people out, and especially also to help entrepreneurs out. And I was wondering, how is it possible that this change is so easily accommodated? And could it be that politics itself plays a role? Because right-wing politicians who have supported the austerity policies were now confronted with a pandemic in which they had to force entrepreneurs to bring down the scale of their business and actually incur great losses on their own voters. Do you think there is a relationship, or are there other explanations why we so easily, at least in circles of economists and politicians, made this tremendous change from no austerity to public money, and not creating public money, no, getting it from the financial markets? So we have to pay it back also. What would be your view on this?
Yeah, okay, thanks for this excellent question. That's a very interesting issue. One of your remarks was, could it be politics? And I smiled to myself because, yes, of course, there is no economics without politics. Economics is not, in that sense, I was always going to say a hard science. It is a science, but it's a science that is always has a political side to it. Which means that you always have to reckon with ideologies and power and the dynamics of these things. I think there are two reasons for the big difference in the role of government finances in the great financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, and the great lockdown of 2020 and 21. The first is that since that austerity response, a consensus has grown that this was the wrong response. That's a lesson learned. Already when austerity was being implemented, also in this country, as you know, there was criticism from many economists, and subsequently there has been a lot of debate, and there has developed a consensus that this extreme austerity response has not been productive, and that it was a mistake. So that was the situation in which the Corona crisis struck. So there was no automatic response in terms of austerity, because we agreed that was not the right response to a crisis. The second reason for the generous government assistance this time round is that the government, as you said, the government forced companies to close down. So there was a very clear responsibility for the government to also do something about it. Another way, well, it's a related point. This was clearly what economists call an outside shock. If you have a bit of a narrow view, this was a shock that didn't come from the economic system itself, not from the Dutch economic system or the European economic system or the financial system. In the previous crisis, you could still make the argument, well, this is what companies or banks or whatever, they've been taking too much risk. They should now suffer. And it's only natural that some of them are going to go broke. But this time it was clear that companies were forced by the government to close down, that this hit the Dutch economy or European economies from outside. Only when you take a much bigger view can you say, well, the way we organized our economic system actually has a lot to do with the occurrence of this crisis, because of globalization and invasion by humans of natural habitats of viruses. But that's the bigger view. If you look at it a little bit more narrowly, it was clearly an outside shock, and then there is also a good economic argument to support firms there. So those are two reasons, I think. And there's actually a third reason, which I mentioned in my introduction, and that's that the pendulum has swung further. It was already moving, I think, 10 years ago. A lot of people are already dissatisfied with capitalism the way we had it, and this has only become much stronger in the last 10 years when inequality has grown so much, and there's so many more signs that the system is failing most of the people who are living within the system. So those things were coming together in the Corona crisis.
Okay, well, that's I think a clear answer. It serves me to ask one more question, because given that we now have seen the mistake of 12 years ago, and we have now this new policy for good reasons, as you said, of spending lots of money to help out at least some businesses. What we see now is that we are actually, if I understand it correctly, lending this money from the financial markets, which basically means that many people now, you might say even young people with businesses, become dependent on the loans which are given to them mostly by, you might say, rich people or via private equity. So I'm wondering, we have this debate also in Sustainable Finance Lab. I'm wondering if this is the only way to help us out by making us, in a sense, more indebted to, relatively speaking, rich people, or could we do what is suggested in modern monetary theory? Could we simply create this money by governments, and then it is not a debt, it's a debt to ourselves, which we can just get rid of whenever we want. So what is, I think this is, yeah, a question which to me is an important one, and I think you have an answer which is interesting to listen to.
I hope I do. In the first place, my answer is this has already happened in a sort of roundabout way. So governments have issued debt, which means they have sold their IOUs, their debt obligations, to private investors, among them pension funds and hedge funds and other investors, in return for money which they've spent in the Corona crisis. But the ECB, the European Central Bank, has bought those treasuries, those government debt obligations, bonds, from private investors on a massive scale. So the asset purchase programs are really there to support governments to go on issuing debt and go on collecting money. And investors are happy to do that, to give money for government bonds, because they know they can sell the bonds to the ECB. And the bonds end up on the ECB balance sheet to a large extent. And so it is already a debt to ourselves because it's held in our central bank. What you might criticize, and I would agree with you, is that this has to go through the private market, so that there are private investors who make a lot of money on making this happen when we could do it directly. And in some cases, it has been done directly. In my view, it should have been done directly on a much larger scale. And you don't need MMT for that. This is monetary financing, which was much more common until about 40 years ago, until the free market financial liberalization reforms started kicking in. And so the question now is what to do with the debt that the ECB holds on its balance sheet against governments. Piketty, the famous French economist, has actually issued a call a few, I think a month ago or so, to actually wipe out this debt. So this just to cross off the balance sheet the debt that the ECB holds against its own governments. And there's nothing to stop us doing that. Other proposals have been to convert this debt to perpetual, so to make them into nominal debt, but not debt that needs to be repaid. So effectively, it's not debt, or to, in other ways, to isolate this debt as a Corona liability that we're not going to treat like normal debt that needs to be paid down because it was a special debt. The reason that some economists, not me, but some economists think that the debt really should be repaid is that in the first place, otherwise it creates so-called moral hazard. So if governments can freely finance themselves and do whatever they like, some economists mistrust governments so much that they don't like governments doing that. And I think that's a very mistaken view, to mistrust governments more than you mistrust markets. There's no good reason to do that. The second reason makes a little bit more sense, and that is that so much money has been pumped into the economy, if you like, that this might well cause inflationary pressures. That's not unthinkable. I don't think that's a big problem. 5% inflation would be fine in my book. But if you think inflation is a problem, then paying down the debt, which means taxing more, which means taking money out of the economy, would counter the inflation probably. So that would be a way to reverse the big injection of money partly in the future again. Those are the things that economists have in mind when they think about, should this debt be repaid, yes or no? But it's certainly not the case, as it has been in previous episodes, that there is a sort of consensus among economists that this debt needs to be repaid no matter what. There are economists who say that this is going to be a burden for our children and the debt needs to be repaid left or right. But there's now also many more economists who say, hold a moment, why should we do that? And in what terms should we do that? Shouldn't we take much longer to repay it, if at all? So there's going to be an interesting debate here.
Okay, thank you very much for this, because I think this is at least a good ending of my intervention, because it's in a way quite hopeful, because you're saying we have these large amounts of money now for the pandemic, but possibly in the future for the sustainable development activities, and they not necessarily have to be a burden for next generations or our young people. And I think this is an important question, that it not necessarily has to be so, because this is what you hear nowadays quite often in the media. I am wondering if there are any other questions, but not being able to see the audience and not even seeing Alison, who might know this.
There's one other question, Ber. So the final question is, what is the biggest barrier to making these changes that are needed long term, and do you think that they will be overcome?
Okay. So.
Thank you, Alison, for passing on that question. That is a very big question. I can only answer it it's a very general question also. I can also answer it in very general terms. I think the biggest barrier is very generic. It's the combination of ideology and politics. And ideology, I don't mean that as a nasty word. I mean that in a very clean sense, if you like, as a set of ideas. Ideology is a set of ideas which, because it's an ideology, it becomes a sort of a measure in itself. It stops us from seeing facts. The subtitle of my book, on which this article is based, is quote, there is enough money, but we don't use it well. There is enough money, but we don't use it well, unquote. The problem is not that we cannot do the things that we need to do. There is enough money to do it. We have the technology to do it. It's a question of political will, and political will in turn is very much dependent on ideology. It's what politicians believe is the right thing to do, and even more indirectly, it's what politicians believe that their electorates believe. So for instance, we need to make huge changes in the property market because many young people, even 40 minus young people, don't have access to good housing at normal prices. But many politicians are afraid to introduce taxes on property to fight speculation, because they believe that property taxes will alienate their electorates and that they will be voted out of office. These are beliefs, whether or not they are correct. And when you start looking at the facts and all the things that are possible, given the money we have and the technology we have, a lot of these things melt away. So the question is, and why doesn't it happen? Well, it happens because politicians need a different frame of mind. And partly the reason I wrote my book is to explain in terms that I think are accessible to everybody. You don't need to have to be an economist or a scientist to understand this, to understand that we are really, we as a society, we have tremendous opportunities. We are very rich. We are very technologically advanced to do the things that need doing. But it's in our heads are the biggest barriers.
Great,
Okay.
thanks, Dirk. Did you have any comments, Bert, before we close?
Well, I just first of all want to thank Dirk Bezemer for his presentation and the discussion we had, although the discussion was really between the two of us mostly, but maybe that was still enjoyable for some other people. And secondly, I think that in a sense, we can be relatively optimistic about the content of what we heard. So let's see if this will work out in the right direction for our global sustainability efforts.
Great, thanks, Bert. And I'd like to echo what Bert was saying, and also thank Dirk for taking part. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar. There are more webinars in this series that you can register your interest for, so do check out the information on the Global Sustainability website. And thank you very much for attending. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity. Bye-bye.